Okay, welcome to Module 13, Learning Objective 2.1, looking at net capital outflow and how it's the link between supply and demand for the loanable funds market and the foreign exchange market. This particular lecture really kind of expands upon Figure 4 on page 691 in your text, so you might want to have that available to you as we kind of discuss this particular topic. Okay, first of all, we're going to start with the loanable funds diagram. As we said before, that the loanable funds diagram in this savings is our national savings that we talked about in previous chapters, which is made up of private savings, GDP, minus taxes, minus consumption, plus public savings, which is taxes less government spending. Those two things added together give us national savings in our loanable funds market. And one thing that we've added, which is a little bit different, the demand for loanable funds. Again, these would be the borrowers borrowing for investment, and also individuals or foreign markets or individuals investing. This would be our net capital outflow. Where these two meet, where the demand for loanable funds and national savings intersect, that would be our real rate of interest, and then the amount of loanable funds would be the intersection in the loanable funds market. Again, just remembering a few things, that both investment and net capital outflow are negatively correlated to the real interest rate, so the demand curve, as we've said before, is downward sloping. This is very similar to what you see in your book in Figure 4. Taking the loanable funds market that we've just looked at in the previous slide, right here, which is panel A. If we take that real interest rate and extend it over, so I'm going to kind of follow, if you just follow my kind of arrow here, and extend that real interest rate over, we see that that real interest rate will hit net capital outflow. If we drop that down, then we see that the supply of dollars, or the money supply, is perfectly inelastic. We've talked about that before in previous chapters. But the important part in this particular discussion is that panel B, net capital outflow, becomes the tying graph that takes the market for loanable funds and correlates it or ties it into the real exchange rate. So if we take this real interest rate in panel A, extend it into panel B, it hits net capital outflow. And again, in the previous learning objectives, we said that the real interest rate is negatively correlated to net capital outflow, and that's why that's downward sloping. If we then extend that down, we get the money supply. The demand then for US dollars is what we see here in panel C. That's what we mean by that demand curve here. And where the supply of US dollars intersect with the demand of US dollars, that then becomes the real exchange rate. So let's go ahead and look at this process a little more in depth. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit. The budget was balanced. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine the effects on the real interest rate and net capital outflow. So let's kind of talk through this together. So first of all, you probably should be thinking about how the market for loanable funds works. So we know that if the government is running a budget deficit, then that's going to impact public savings, which is part of national savings or part of the supply curve in the loanable funds market. Just as we talked about before in the crowding out effect, when we run a deficit, that's going to shift the supply curve inward or to the left to S1. That's going to increase the real interest rate. So we started off here at R, and we're going to move up to R1. If we move over then, and we have net capital outflow, if we then extend that real interest rate to net capital outflow, and then drop it down into our money supply, And you're probably already thinking ahead here. If we drop that down into our money supply, then the money supply is going to shift backward, and our exchange rate is going to increase. So let's see if that's in fact what happens. Okay, so here we go. The supply curve shifted inward, yes, which increased the real interest rate. As we see here, the real interest rate goes up to R2. So net capital outflow decreases, which makes sense because individuals now see U.S. bonds as more attractive. So we have capital stays here at home. More people invest here at home because the real interest rate went up. How does that work out then into the real exchange rate? Well, we would follow this line here down into the real exchange rate and see how that's affected. And I think we should. And coming up here in a minute. Here we go. And so what we would see is originally at where the net capital outflow was, it would have been over here. And so moved back, and the exchange rate does in fact go up. So the exchange rate adjusts to balance supply and demand for dollars in the foreign currency exchange. Okay? So remember that net exports and net capital outflow, again, investment kind of equal to our net exports, and supply is equal to our net capital outflow. So an increase in the exchange rate, again, U.S. goods more expensive to foreigners, reducing the demand for U.S. goods and for U.S. dollars. So when we think about this, when a U.S. resident buys importers' goods, does the transaction affect supply or demand in the foreign exchange market? Well, the supply of dollars does in fact increase, okay? So again, we have to sell dollars to get the currency to buy the imports. That is in fact true. And then the demand for dollars decreases, again reducing that net exports. And so net export is really kind of in a sense the net demand for dollars, okay? Again, kind of easier to think about the second view as opposed to the first. And then this is the flip side of that kind of idea. When a foreigner buys a U.S. asset, kind of what happens in the supply and demand diagram. And again, this one is a little bit easier to kind of consider. Supply of dollars falls, the transaction reduces net capital outflow, and again, that's kind of the supply of dollars that we think of. And so really it's the net kind of supply of dollars that we see for the world economy. Okay, so initially the government budget is balanced and trade is balanced. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit, and again we saw that that will make the interest rate rise and net capital outflow fall. Does the budget deficit affect the U.S. real exchange rate and the balance of trade? So again, this is kind of what we're furthering on in these particular, and as we see, and as we have already said, then what happens is net capital outflow does in fact decrease, which causes the exchange rate, the real exchange rate, to appreciate, and so that makes U.S. goods more expensive in foreign markets, and so that reduces the amount of exports that we have, and the budget deficit then causes a trade deficit. So that's kind of ultimately in this example that we're working here in this problem where we end up. So again, just kind of furthering the exercise is once our U.S. exchange rate, our U.S. dollar exchange rate goes up, U.S. goods become more expensive relative to foreign goods, and then people will not demand U.S. goods, so we will export less, which then makes a trade deficit. Okay, and so these next couple slides just kind of sum up the effect of this budget deficit and kind of what happened and the sequence of events. Again, this can be pretty complicated, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks.